Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Nice to be here. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for putting up with me speaking in English for this presentation. The irony is that I'm actually missing a Swedish class to be here right now. So if I'm still presenting in English next year, you'll all be partly to blame. Okay, so let me see. This was a little pre-study where we looked at how to accelerate the electrification of the trucking sector and through deploying charging infrastructure at different types of logistics sites. And for this, we examined 3 different types of logistics sites as case studies. And we try and compare sort of how effective it would be to, and what role that will play in sort of the overall electrification of the sector by sort of how useful it would be to electrify each one and which ones should maybe be considered first. And the 3 different types of sites we looked at were fuel sites, refueling stations, so Circle K, for example, rail Combi terminals, and also logistics warehouses and centers. And for this, we visited the sites. We interviewed site owners and drivers and the haulers who use the sites, as well as people in the logistics chain more generally. And for each of the case studies, we wanted to answer sort of these 3 questions you see on the screen here. You know, what role they each play, either separately or together, and how can charging practically be implemented on the sites, and what are some of those business considerations that must be taken into account. So I'll jump straight in to sort of talk about each of the sites in regards to answering those 3 questions. So the first site is a Combi terminal in Malmo. This is a rail terminal where sort of a lot of trucks will come with containers or swap bodies. They'll either load or unload, and those will travel by rail to other parts of Sweden, where at the end of the journey, they'll also be loading and unloading. Apologies, this isn't meant to be this isn't sponsored by Gubbens Gatterkök or any of the other ones you see on screen there. But if you can see it a little bit closer at home, you can make out some of the features of this site, which is that you can see there's a loop of road, which is about 800 meters. And that's sort of where this trucks will enter, and they'll sort of do a loop, and along the way somewhere, they'll either drop off or pick up some load from there and then exit again through the same loop. And this site caters to, well, the sort of trucks that tend to serve this site come from, you know, sort of all sorts of sort of driving routines, long haul, regional, short distance, and it mainly deals with cargo shipping containers and swap bodies. So some of the other features about the site is that, I mean, obviously there's railway tracks there. There are some overhead cranes. It's a one-way drivable loop. Like I said, 800 meters, but that would take about 10 to 15 minutes for trucks to complete the loop, including loading and unloading time. And for almost the entire time after they enter the site, they'll be sort of driving along or moving, albeit, you know, quite slowly. But there's very little areas in the site where they'll actually be at rest. And there's a multi-day storage area, as well as a check-in booth at the start of the driveway there. And in terms of the findings, what role can sort of electrifying such a logistics site play in sort of the overall picture of electrifying road freight? So most haulers, it can play a modest role. Most haulers do, you know, visit these sites. They do container and swap body freight. And so it's not abnormal for most haulers to have some vehicles that will use these sites you know, throughout day-to-day operations. But in general, very few haulers will have enough sort of business with these sites that they'll have specific vehicles dedicated to just doing these routes. But there is, that said, there is a subsector that do specialize in container freight. And this in North America is referred to as drayage, or I think in Sweden it's just container trucking. We'll come back to this point towards the end of the presentation, where we kind of talk about opportunities for further research and projects. But this is one of those subsectors that should be further investigated, and that have been projects overseas, like in California, for example, where they've really focused in on this sector, on this subsector, as a way to invest in the electrification of trucks, because it is very strategic and easy to electrify. On the other question of, how can charging be practically implemented on these sites? Well, this raises some interesting points, because the nature of these sites makes them not very friendly towards overhead conductive wires, or just the standard plug-in cable charging. So it will, if you were to do sort of charging on these sites, it will have to be some sort of dynamic charging. And if we just take a look, this is also an example of why you can't have overhead conductive wires on the site, because you do have these reach stackers, which play an important part in loading, unloading the containers. So yeah, dynamic charging is possibly the only way in which you could get any kind of charging to take place on these sites. And this is not a mature market technology, but we do have lots of trials in Sweden, or we've had several trials in Sweden using different types of dynamic charging technologies. And these are the ones that are ground-based, so either inductive under the ground, or conductive, a rail that's kind of buried into the ground. And there could be some interesting economics with this. You don't have to install a charger and a cable for every vehicle that uses it. You could have the inductive charging or the dynamic charging throughout 800 meters of track, and then every truck on site could have access to that. So there could be some economic payoffs, but obviously we need to do a little bit of further investigation before we can make any clear conclusions there. And as the trucks do spend about 50 minutes on site, that's kind of the charging window you have. We don't have sort of clear, fast charging for trucks is not developed at the same point that they are for cars. But to use an example, what can 50 minutes do for an Hyundai Ioniq today? They're supposed to charge from 5% to 80% in about 16 minutes. So this could actually be, quite a meaningful opportunity for trucks if they ever, get to the same ability to fast charge as cars do today. And in terms of business considerations, well, there is the added complexity with the cost of, if you do have dynamic charging, then not only do you need to have electric trucks, but each of those will need to sort of install their own receivers that allow you to connect to it. And for, as I mentioned earlier, for most of these trucks that visit these sites only make up a small proportion of their overall routes. So, whether it will pay off for them to, sort of install these chargers in order to tap into that, and whether that'll be worth it, is one of those considerations. And another one is that these sites are operational the whole year round, and they're, very sensitive to interruptions and disruptions. So something that is so infrastructure heavy in terms of installing a rail into the ground, there's no sort of second lane in this loop. So yeah, the infrastructure and sort of the installation requirements need to be taken into account as well. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the first site. The second site is, I'm just keeping my eye on the time here, so maybe I have to breeze through a little bit more. So this is a terminal, freight terminal in Borås with DB Schenker. And, it's one of 20 such terminals that DB Schenker has throughout the country. And it's in Viared, which is itself a logistics hub. And so, yeah, one of the reasons we chose this is because it's quite a typical terminal. There's nothing about it that kind of really stands out. And so, in terms of the role that these terminals can play if we set up charging infrastructure, This is, a much more important role than the previous example, because, a much higher volume of goods are passing through logistics terminals, and this volume of goods is growing all the time, driven by e-commerce, warehouse automation, and digitization. And so particular routes like the regional line haul routes between these terminals are going to be a key element of freight electrification. And it's also part of this kind of first fleet electrification strategy, which is where a fleet first strategy, which is where, the companies that own, sort of large fleets of vehicles, they're the ones who are most likely going to be in a position to electrify some of those fleet first to kind of spread the risk out. As you know, most of the hauliers in Sweden are actually, sort of very small businesses. And so, yeah, for them, it will be a much more difficult proposition to electrify. So how can charging be implemented? There's also, some interesting implications from this, because if you look at the charging sites, and so where chargers generally located on trucks, they're located near where the driver's cabin is. But on these sites, the truck kind of backs into the terminal. So you get situations where the charging ports of the trucks are actually 10, 15, or even 20 meters away from where the terminal is itself. And so, of course, this makes it very difficult to have a cable that you have to plug in. First of all, cables don't make them that long because, you have, they're very heavy, and they also have active cooling in them. So for any kind of fast charging cables, like this will require some kind of a bespoke solution. And also, you have to consider, where will the power cabinets be placed as well, because these are, they take up several square meters, and the way these warehouses are structured, they're, each door is very close to each other, and so it's going to be very difficult to kind of find the required space. So this is a very kind of like practical, space-orientated challenge to do. And of course, this brings to mind, opportunities for ground-based charging. And then I think, sorry, Nicholas, how are we doing for time? Is it?
We have 2 more minutes.
2 more minutes? Okay. So maybe I'll just skip ahead to the Circle K site, which is our 3rd case study. This is a fuel station. It's 5 minutes from the port of Gothenburg, and it's a fuel station that's designed to cater towards large trucks. And you have a high proportion of long haul trucks from overseas using this. It has, full facilities, showers, Wi-Fi, all the good stuff. And so, we looked at, what it will mean to electrify such sites. It makes a lot of sense, because all freight vehicles use fuel stations, regardless of, what kind of journeys, trips they undertake on a day-to-day basis. And also truck stops are a really important part of this. Even if you can charge somewhere else, you need to take breaks, and you can't just take a break at a cafe, because parking for a truck is very special. So and if you are going to sort of electrify fuel stations, though, compared to the logistic terminals, one of the considerations is that, you have to choose which ones, because there are a lot more fuel stations than there are logistics terminals. So you have to, think about which of those ones to choose, which are strategically located near places where truck drivers tend to take those breaks. And for this, because fuel stations don't usually have their own fleet of trucks, they can't just take we'll build it here and then we'll have, a captive audience of users. So they will need to coordinate with logistics terminals, ideally, in terms of deciding, which fuel stations to begin implementing charging infrastructure in it to begin with, when volumes of electric trucks are still low. But when you're looking at implementing the charging on the site, there's actually sort of no standout sort of barriers like we had with the other two logistics sites. And then business considerations, yeah, some sites, have a lot more long haul trucks using them, and some sites have a lot more sort of regional trucks. And this is one of the important considerations because it's long haul trucking is likely to be amongst the last in the sector to electrify. And also you need to focus on the stops where truck drivers are taking those 30-minute rest stops as opposed to where truck drivers are just traditionally using the places to refuel today. And I think I'll stop there. And yeah, we can jump to questions. Sorry, I didn't get through everything.
Oh, no worries. It's hard to keep time when you have so much interesting things to say.
Thank you. I hope it is interesting.
Thank you very much, Bobby. Very interesting presentation. Just in like 30 seconds, what is the key takeout from your presentation? You were talking about dynamic charging. You were talking about where to build chargers at what station to adapt it with driver schedules of the drivers, etc.
Yeah.
If there's one takeout from your study, what is
I think the key takeout is that if you are going to implement sort of charging at sites, you can't just focus on one of these types of sites, because if you look at sort of how vehicles, the sort of haulers work here, they don't usually have one vehicle doing the same thing every day. Those vehicles, have really varied assignments. They could be, going to a shipping terminal one day. Another day they could, be doing line haul between two logistics terminals. Another day, they could be sort of doing something else, regional distribution. So for this, it's better, instead of just focusing on one type of logistics sites, to kind of take a regional approach. So we're going to sort of invest in charging at all the different types of logistics infrastructures in this region, and then you can get a network effect from that, rather than kind of spread that investment out on just fuel sites across the whole country, or on just logistics terminals across the whole country. Yeah.
Thank you.